Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about ice storm cleanup and recovery for your woodlot. Our speaker is Elliott Groen, R.P.F in training, and he's the Sustainable Forestry Coordinator at both Ontario Woodlot Association and Kawartha Land Trust. I think I will just pass it over to you, Elliott, and we can get going. I'll also just mention that this presentation is being recorded, and you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can after Elliott's talk. Thanks so much, and now I will pass it over to you, Elliott.
Thanks, Olivia. All right. Can you see my screen there?
Yeah, looks good.
Perfect. So today we're going to talk about ice storm recovery and cleanup. And to some extent, this does apply to other forms of storm recovery as well. So don't know how many of you are members. Maybe you can write in the chat if you are a member, where you're from, what chapter. But this is what we're all about at the OWA, helping each other become the best possible stewards of our woodlands. And there's a lot that goes into that. But broadly, we want our woodlots to be sustainable and productive, ecologically healthy and diverse, and spiritually and physically renewing. This picture here was from a camp that we helped organize for the U of T master students this past winter. All kinds of products and services that we provide. This is our latest Woodlander cover. Next one's going to be coming out soon. Also do all kinds of other things, including the big provincial conference coming up in a few weeks. That's paired with the International Model Forest Forum as well. Some more covers of the different Woodlanders that we produced last year. And here is where most of our members are located across 20 chapters provincially. All right, so this is the satellite imagery from around 10 o'clock on Saturday night, March the 29th. And you can see those heavy cells of precipitation moving from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan across southern Ontario. And we had a lot of ice. That picture is from Eleanor Reed, one of our members and president of the Kawartha chapter. Yeah. It's the most devastating ice storm in recent history. Started on March 28th and continued into Sunday, March 30th. Not quite as bad as the ice storm in 1998, but definitely worse than some of the ice storms that we had in 2013 and 2016. Ice accumulated anywhere from 5 to 30 millimeters. At one point, over 1 million homes and businesses were without power in Ontario and Quebec. And in some areas, the outages lasted weeks before hydro could get it fixed up. The estimate is that there was approximately 342 million, not $342, but 342 million in insurance damage, and many municipalities issued a state of emergency. By doing this, they were able to access funding, and that funding is what is allowing for all of this curbside chipping. A few weeks ago, Jacob Outram, R.P.F. and arborist, gave a presentation at our Kawartha chapter. He's been doing a lot of this cleanup, so I'm sharing a bit of a public service announcement on behalf of all of the arborists. It's much easier for them to clean up if the fallen branches are placed butts to the curb, and one large branch is much easier to chip than 20 small pieces. Of course, you may be limited based on how much space you have, but if you can do this, if it hasn't been picked up in your area, it makes it a lot easier and more efficient for the arborists that are cleaning up all of this storm damage. So there are some trees that are generally more vulnerable to ice storm damage, and these are usually the early successional and open-grown species. So these are things like birch, poplar, elm, willows, Manitoba maple, and silver maple. They're faster growing, which means they have less dense wood. And because they're usually growing out in the open, they've got a higher chance of forming V unions rather than U unions, where their branches start to split apart. V unions are more likely to split because there's included bark. So it's not wood that's holding it together at that union, but it's bark that can get moisture in it, more likely to rot, and it just isn't as strong. So the picture on the right-hand side here is of some black walnut, and you can see where that red circle is. There's a long seam, and the branch union looks more like a V. That is going to be much more likely to split than that U-shaped union that you can see at the next tree over. Yeah, where basically the wood fibers are holding it together there. There are also other species that can be vulnerable to ice storm damage. Some examples are red pine plantations that have very low live crown ratios. Skinny trees, not a lot of crown to hold the tree up, not a lot of trunk taper. They're more likely to completely snap off when that ice load accumulates in the crown. UGS, unacceptable growing stock trees that have got diseases that are degrading the wood quality. So beech bark disease, emerald ash borer, different cankers that affect hardwoods like Utapella or target. And then also another example would be cedars. So cedars have fibrous root systems. They don't have a big taproot that's holding them down into the lower levels of the soil. And when they're on shallow or wet soils, they're much more likely to topple over. So mid to late successional species are generally less vulnerable. They're slower growing, which translates into denser wood. When they do suffer damage, it's more likely to be smaller branches that break rather than huge chunks of the crown falling off or the stem snapping in half. So examples of species are sugar maple, American beech, ironwood, eastern hemlock, oaks, and hickories. White pine can also be put in this category, especially if it has good form. It's likely to only shed some of its lower branches rather than have parts of the crown break off completely. So yeah, this picture over here, you can see the white pine. Maybe doesn't have the best form for lumber with those multiple leaders, but those multiple leaders are coming apart in those U union shapes. So you can see here for the most part, it's just the lower branches that broke off and the crown is still mostly intact. So yeah, generally shorter and fatter trees are stronger. Depends a little bit again on how that crown is distributed, but generally they're going to be stronger. And damage from ice storms, it's a form of natural disturbance and it's a part of forest dynamics. Some of this damage can be partially mitigated by good forest management. So we're going to talk a little bit about disturbance and good forest management here. So forests are dynamic equilibriums. They're always changing, but they're staying in this relatively balanced state where there are always trees. But the structure, so the size of the trees, how many age classes there are, and the composition in terms of species diversity is changed through disturbance events. So in the forest region that this ice storm affected the most, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, gap phase dynamics are the most common form of disturbance. These can happen on a single tree level or in smaller or larger gaps. So things like bacteria, insects, fungi attack single trees or small groups of trees. Wind can knock over single trees or larger groups. Same with ice and low intensity fires. So as much as it sucks and as much damage as occurred, this ice storm is a natural part of forest dynamics and succession. Typically, the turnover rate that we see in our forests in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region is about 1% a year. So if there's 100 trees in a forest, about one tree is going to die every year, and then one new tree is going to grow. But in the case of events like this ice storm, this can happen in much larger gaps. You might have lost a lot more trees in a shorter phase in a period of a few days. So here's some pictures showing examples of what this looks like. This is a red pine plantation um, in the southern part of the Kawarthas. Picture one is looking south. Picture two, I'm standing in the same spot and looking to the north. So you can see looking to the north, very, very little damage at all. And then there's a small canopy gap, about a tree length and a half, that was created from trees succumbing to the ice storm. Here's another example of gap phase dynamics. This is from another very good webinar that was hosted a few months ago through Cornell's Forest Connect series. And Thomas Worthley, extension forester with the University of Connecticut, was sharing some results from a study that he did. And in this study, they basically took dead wood and created a slash carpet around oak regeneration that was still below a certain height where it was more vulnerable to being browsed by deer. And basically what they found is that all of this dead wood around the oak regeneration slowed down the amount that deer were browsing on these oaks and allowed them to grow up into the canopy in the 3 to 7 years that that slash was protecting the oak regeneration. So gap phase dynamics, they're a part of how our forest changes and can be good in certain cases. Okay, so how can we prevent damage through good forest management? Very broadly, we're going to manage for the structural and biological diversity that's appropriate to the site and to the health condition of the forest on that site. So structural diversity on a single tree level, we already talked about this. Shorter, fatter trees that have a higher live crown ratio are more structurally stable than tall, skinny trees. So think of mature oak that's got big, strong branches versus skinny spaghetti noodle tree of a red pine in a red pine plantation. Generally, the height of trees is related to the soils and the diameter is related to the density. On a stand level, when we're talking about structural diversity, we're talking about multiple age classes. And when we've got multiple age classes, we've got diversity in that vertical canopy structure. So if you think back to that example from the Cornell webinar, you already have oak regeneration in the understory. Then if you get damage in the overstory, at least there's something there to replace it and you're not starting from scratch. And then when we're talking about biological diversity, it's about having the appropriate level of species diversity to the site. In some cases, that could be 9, 10 different species within a forest. In other cases, if the soils are more limiting or the bedrock is closer to the surface, it might be fewer species. So managing for structural and biological diversity, and then when we're factoring in the forest health, there's different things that we can do for that. So an example would be reducing the amount of unacceptable growing stock through silvicultural thinnings. For example, cutting maples that have major defects for personal firewood. That would be something that we could do in the overstory. In terms of younger forests, an example would be cutting back multiple leaders where white pine weevil has taken that central leader off the white pine and multiple leaders have sprung up from it. Especially want to cut back those multiple leaders if they're forming V union. And when we're doing this type of juvenile pruning, something that we can generally do just by ourselves with limited equipment. And it makes a huge difference later on as that tree continues to grow. Important note, don't prune any oaks or elms during the growing season. And that's because of oak wilt and Dutch elms disease. They're spread by bark beetles, which are attracted to open wounds. So you don't want to prune any oaks or elms during the growing season. And yeah, If you don't know what you're doing or you want some more advice, it's always recommended to work with a registered professional forester for any planning and implementation. Okay? So picture on the right-hand side here, you can see there's good structural and biological diversity in this forest. There's multiple species, there's at least 3 different age classes and crown positions. And this is going to be a forest that's more resilient to ice storm damage compared to a forest that doesn't have as much structural and biological diversity. Okay, so we'll move on to assessing damage. Of course, it all starts with a map. Got to know where you're going. This can be a hand-drawn map. The Ministry of Natural Resources has an online application called Make a Natural Heritage Map that allows you to see your property lines, and you can overlay other layers like wetland and whatnot on there. There's also applications that you can use on your phone or tablet, like Avenza. And then of course there's GPSs as well. So make sure you have some kind of map to start off with. And then on that map, you can draw out your management zones and link them in with your objectives. So for example, on my North Trail, I want to reopen access, and in the areas where it's too dangerous or there's just too much debris down, I want to divert that trail so that I can still access all areas of the woodlot. In a sugar bush, could be removing trees, fallen over lines. And in a plantation, it might be assessing for salvage potential for a bigger harvest. So once we've got our map, once we know what our management zones are and our objectives in those zones, we're going to determine our sampling method, how big our plots are going to be, the amount of plots that we're going to put into an area, and if we're randomly distributing them or if we're strategically distributing them. So in a sugar bush, I might be looking at every tree. In a plantation, I might be only looking at smaller plot sizes. And then on my trail, it might not even really be any formal kind of plots. I'm just going to walk down or drive down the trail with a chainsaw in hand. So here's some examples in that sugar bush. Maybe I'm marking every tappable tree with over 50% crown damage because I want to assess it through the next few growing seasons for crown recovery and determine if I can still get sap out of it or if I'm going to cut it to make space for the younger trees in the understory to come up. And then in plantations, not going to be looking at every tree, maybe divide it up into 100 square meter plots and put in one of those per hectare. And yes, once you've determined all of that, gather your needed tools and conduct your inventory. Determine follow-up actions and the timelines for those follow-up actions, and then implement and retain help as needed. Okay, so when we're assessing damage on individual trees, safety first. Even when it looks like a branch is wedged into place, it can come down with a moment's notice. So always be aware of your surroundings. Probably don't go into a woodlot that's been recently damaged on a windy day, as it's much more likely that the branches will be falling at that time. And a lot of these images that are on this slide are from the extension notes that are available online in our library. This one in particular is from Caring for Ice Damaged Woodlots and Plantations. Okay, so what we can see on the right-hand side there at the top is how to evaluate deciduous trees for damage. So you're basically going to be looking at the crown and then dividing it up into sections and assessing how much damage has occurred. So if there's 0 to 25% loss of the crown, likely to have little effect on the tree's health, and it's going to grow back within that year to 3 years after the storm into a full canopy. Trees that have 25 to 50% crown loss are generally going to survive. 51 to 75%, you're going to start to see a mix. Some are going to survive, some are not. And if it's got greater than 75% crown loss, some may survive, but it's unlikely to recover a full canopy at any point in time. When we had that ice storm in 1998, there was a whole bunch of studies that came out of that. And most trees that had over 75% crown damage were dead within 3 years. So this is why it's good to not go out too quickly and start cutting things down, because in many cases these trees will recover, but we don't necessarily know yet which ones are going to recover. So for ones that, it's not very clear, consider flagging or marking them so that you can come back over the next 2 to 3 years. But yeah, with deciduous trees, we're basically looking at that 3-year window as a good threshold where we can assess if the more heavily damaged trees are going to grow back or are going to succumb to the damage. If they do grow back, it might still take some time, might take up to 10 years. But at 3 years after the storm, we'll have a pretty good idea. So if we move a little further down there into the middle, it shows some examples of damage in conifer trees. So if it sustains a broken leader, the top branch of the tree, most likely it will recover. If it's broken off mid-crown, it's got a good chance of recovery, but some might die. And if more than 75% of the crown has been broken, it's got a low chance of recovery. And then in terms of trees that are bent over, mostly affecting younger and skinnier trees, if it's got less than a 20-degree bend, it's likely to recover. 60% or 60-degree bend or more, some may recover, some may not. And if it was bent over greater than 60 degrees, there's a very low chance of that recovering. And in that extension note, there's a table that you can use and adapt to your purposes that allows you to assess what size the trees are, classify them by the damage and the amount that they've been bent. This can be good as part of that inventory to get a sense of the damage that was sustained across a stand. If the tree has pre-existing health conditions, it may be in that 25 to 50% crown loss, might be more likely to survive, but if it's got Eudipella canker, it's going to be less likely to survive. So yeah, factor in those other conditions as well. And yeah, like I was saying, monitor canopy recovery multiple times if you can throughout the season, and definitely over multiple years. And we're really looking at how full the canopy is and how many secondary and tertiary branches are coming off of the main branches. Throughout the year, as you're monitoring your woodlot, also look for other stressors that can compound the damage from the ice storm. So that could be things like spongy moth or forest tent caterpillar infestations. If we have a bad drought this year, that's going to impact how well the canopy recovers. Or if we have any late frost after the buds have broken, that could damage the young leaves, and then the tree's got to put more energy into budding out again. All of those can be compounding stressors. So on average, canopy recovery will take 3 to 5 years for healthier trees with damage less than 50%. And it could take about 10 years for trees that have lower vigor or where the damage in the canopy was greater than 50%. Many ways to assess the overall health of the tree, but one way is through bark vigor. So picture that you can see here, all sugar maple, all roughly the same diameter. You can see much coarser bark on the left and much smoother bark on the right. Generally, trees with smoother bark and tighter bark have higher vigor, and trees with looser and coarser bark have lower vigor. Okay, so what follow-up actions can we take for individual trees? Definitely not going to be every single tree in the woodlot, but there might be some cases where pruning is going to improve the health of the tree. So again, safety first. Only prune what you can safely reach. Generally, we don't want to be working over our shoulders. And we don't want to be working, it's like with sketchy ladders or we can't really secure 3 points of contact. Um, Only cut what you can safely cut. Um, so with juvenile trees, this is going to be easier. We already talked a little bit how we can prune things back to a single leader and how this reduces the chance of V unions, which are more vulnerable to breakage. If you can't do this for every tree, like for example, you've got a plantation that's got 2,000 stems per hectare, might not be feasible to do it on every single tree. Maybe consider only pruning a quarter of the trees, 500 trees, and then disperse them across the stand and prioritize trees that have the highest chance of recovery or the highest benefit. So if your objective is to thin out your plantation, you want to consider the trees that have the highest potential to turn into future timber. Another example would be if you've got a hardwood stand and there's only 10 white pines throughout the stand, we want to keep those scattered conifers within a hardwood stand for diversity. So pruning those so that they can grow up healthy and strong would be a good ecological reason to do some of this pruning. For any trees that need pruning, but you can't do it yourself, contract an insured arborist. And pruning is best done in the dormant season and is definitely required for oak and elm. As previously mentioned, we don't want to be introducing those diseases into those trees by pruning them in the growing months. And then in terms of monitoring after your pruning, what you can look at is wound wood formation and the color of the wound itself. So on the left-hand side at the bottom, you can see all of that lighter colored wood. That's wound wood that's healing over the tree. And the wound itself is white. And if I was to go and tap on that, it would feel pretty solid and hard. Compare that to the next picture over on the right. You can barely see, maybe not even any wound wood formation around that branch stub. And you can see how the wood is kind of going dark and punky. The pruning cut might have been good there, but it's not likely to recover, and that tree is going to, in all likelihood, continue to decay from that point. So when we are pruning, the most important thing to know is where the branch collar is, because that wound wood is formed from the branch collar. So that figure on the top there, it's from one of our extension notes on recovering from ice storm damage. It shows you where the bark collar is, and how to make cuts. So we don't want to put too much stress on the cut, so it's good to make a cut further away from where the branch is coming out. That's where you can see cut A, cut B, and then the final cut doesn't have as much weight coming off of it, so it's less likely to tear the bark off of the tree. Okay, straightening out bent trees and the sprouting response of some trees. In terms of straightening out bent trees, it's usually not economically viable. It's going to be a labor of love. You can do it using cables or webbing, like think of the stuff that ratchet straps were made out of, and then anchoring these to the ground. The key when doing this is not to disturb the root system and to be pulling too hard on the tree. Trees with minor leans, they are likely to straighten themselves out. So that's trees that have got less than a 20-degree bend. And they're usually going to do this by June. So a month from now, 2 months from now, if that hasn't happened, it's unlikely that tree is going to straighten out itself. Having some leaning trees in the bush is usually not a concern. You walk around in a natural forest, there are going to be some leaning trees just from the natural disturbance patterns. If you do cut down some of these younger leaning trees, some species have very good sprouting responses where they send up new shoots from the root collar. Many trees do this in our forest. Maples, oaks, basswood, ash, and poplars are some example. The best sprouting response is from younger trees that are cut in the dormant season. So consider evaluating those bent trees in your woodlot this year, the ones that haven't been straightened out by June. Maybe look at pruning those or cutting those right back during the next winter, and then getting a flush of new growth next season. If you get multiple sprouts forming, then you can select the most vigorous one with the best attachment to the root collar. And again, that's going to be if it has that U shape or that V shape. So that there's, with that V shape, we want to avoid that bark on bark rubbing against each other, which is not very strong and is more likely to rot or be a place where fungi and bacteria can grow. Picture over here on the right, that's me. I'm about 6 feet tall. That's a single year of growth from a poplar sprout following the derecho damage. So in some cases, we can have our forest growing back very, very quickly through sprouting responses. Okay, so that was assessing damage for individual trees. Now, on a stand level, we want to consider all of the other factors that are at play. So, how much regeneration is there? What quality is the regeneration? And what's the sylvix? What's the life history? What are the species preferences of that species? So, if we've got a tolerant hardwood bush and the majority of our regeneration is white oak, that's greater than 1 meter in height, and it's still got a live crown ratio of greater than 50%. And there's the right gap in the canopy, roughly 30 to 50% light levels for that to grow into. That's going to be very good regeneration. It's likely to make it into the canopy of our forests. If it's black cherry, that's 1 meter tall. It doesn't have a central leader anymore. It's growing in 3, 4, 5 different directions, and it's got black knot. That's not really quality regeneration, and that's not likely to make it up into the canopy. Some other factors to consider are we may have leaning or damaged trees, but those could be a good thing if we're looking to establish shade-tolerant regeneration. If we start going in there and cutting all of these down, we could open up the canopy too much, and things like sugar maple could get exposed to sun scald, or if they're not at a high enough density, they're more likely to bend over when exposed to other weather events. So we might want to keep some of those leaning or damaged trees just to maintain the appropriate level of shade for our forest. If we've got sugar maple regeneration, but it's still less than 30 centimeters tall and we open up the canopy, we may get too much raspberry coming in. That's going to outcompete the sugar maple. So another example. And yeah, basically that question that we're asking, is natural regeneration sufficient or is artificial regeneration required? Do we want to do some supplemental planting to ensure that we've got the right structural and biological diversity in our woodlots? If planting is a good option, Forest Canada, through the 50 million tree program, has a forest restoration project type, and you can go onto Forest Canada's website and apply to get some funding to help out with that. We also want to consider overall stand diversity. So same as that example that I mentioned earlier. We could have heavily damaged conifers in a hardwood stand that are unlikely to survive, but we don't necessarily want to cut these down because they can still provide good wildlife value as snags or cavity trees. Of course, only provided that they're not a safety hazard. And then another thing to consider when we're assessing damage on a stand level is invasive species. So usually there's going to be higher levels of light after an ice storm or a major disturbance. Usually for most invasive species, that's going to accelerate how much they grow. So can we control them? And if we open up the canopy more, is that just going to create higher spread? And do we have the capacity and the management strategies in place to control them in that case? So some other actions to take following the assessment on a stand level is harvesting. Are we going to cut down any trees? Are we going to leave them in place? Are we going to use them for personal use, or are we going to look to get a commercial harvest going in? Um, so for conifers, they need to be harvested as soon as possible to reduce the chance of blue stain fungus from lowering the quality of wood. Um, Usually this is going to need to happen within 3 months, maybe 6 months at most. If the roots are still attached and the trees have just kind of been pushed over, and there's not large bits of canopy missing, might have a little bit longer. But generally for conifers, you want to get in there as soon as possible, within 3 months, 6 months at most. Hardwoods can get stained too, or start rotting, lowering the wood quality, but they're going to last a little bit longer than conifers. You might have 6 months, a year, maybe 18 months if the roots are still attached and there's still enough canopy for that tree to stay alive. When considering a harvest, it's always recommended to work with an R.P.F. To assess the potential. If it is a viable harvest, develop a prescription, conduct the tree marking, put out multiple bids, arrange the contracts, and supervise the operation. Salvage harvests are slow and dangerous and may not be profitable. So this is always something to consider. The logger may come in, but because of the nature of the work, may not be able to offer any price. They're just going to basically do the cleanup, take the wood to pay for their time, but not generate any revenue. If the harvest does generate revenue, this is considered as income, but costs associated with it. So if you do hire an R.P.F., they can be deducted. Keep track of all of this for tax purposes and reach out to financial experts for help as needed. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about chainsaw safety basics. Following the derecho, we also had a webinar that's available on our YouTube channel. And if you go to around minute 43 of that channel, Brian Lawrence discusses chainsaw safety in greater detail. And also consider taking or organizing a safety course with your local chapter. Regardless of your experience, it's always good to get those reminders and take the opportunity to tune up your skills. So obviously, safety first. When we're using a chainsaw, we're not just making life and death decisions over the tree, but also taking our own lives in our hand. And unfortunately, one person did die near Peterborough after cleaning up ice storm damage. Very sad. And, I'm just putting that up here as a very stark reminder of the chances that we're taking when we do go out there in the bush. So always have your personal protective equipment, chainsaw pens or chaps, safety boots, gloves, helmet, ear protection. If you're doing any climbing or pruning at heights, you want to have all of your safety lines and harnesses well maintained. In terms of your chainsaw, always want to make sure that your chain is nice and sharp. You've checked your air filter, you've checked your carburetor, you've checked the safety features on your saw, like your chain brake, that everything's working. Know what your abilities are. Watch for fatigue. And then be aware of the specific hazards. So dead trees, stags, chicos. If you fell a tree, you might hit that snag chico and that might break off and those branches can go flying. So the Ontario Health and Safety Act basically is looking at 2 tree lengths away from the snag as a safe zone. If you're within 2 tree lengths of that snag, it is a hazard. And if you can safely take it down, you can do that. Or if you can use directional felling to move it away from that snag or chico, that's a good thing. Another safety hazard would be spring poles. So those are smaller trees that are trapped underneath other fallen trees or branches. And if you're cutting the tree or the branch off of them, or if you're trying to cut them themselves, they can whip up and hit you, and it's not a pleasant experience. So generally, the best practice for spring poles is to make a lot of small cuts on the in the direction on the top, and then once the tension has been released, then you can cut right through it. Um, Want to be aware of hung up branches and trees, and figure out if you can safely take down these hung up branches or trees, or the tree that the branch is hung up in. And then always check your escape routes. So you don't want there to be any brush or tripping hazards along the escape routes, and always have multiple escape routes when you are felling a tree or doing cleanup. Okay, some final thoughts before we open it up to questions. Ice storms are a form of natural disturbance, very destructive, but they also produce the ecological dynamics that renew and diversify our woodlots. So they produce down woody debris, which is good for habitat and nutrient cycling. When they tip over trees, they create that pit and mound topography, which is an old growth characteristic and creates little microclimates for small vernal pools to form, for different tree species to regenerate around. They create snags and cavity trees. Those broken branches, some of them will develop into cavity trees, which are good for all of the biodiversity in the woodlot. And they create canopy gaps where tree species can regenerate in. So the disturbance frequency and intensity is expected to increase with climate change. So keep learning about and implementing good forestry practices to make your woodlot as resilient as possible. Avoid the temptation to clean up everything. Focus on the highest priority areas where the natural ecological dynamics can be improved upon or enhanced. Monitor the short and long-term impacts on your trees and your forests, and as always, keep safety in mind with everything that you do. So this picture here, it's from a forest near Uxbridge, and not damaged in the ice storm, but you can see a previous canopy gap that was created. This forest is mostly cedar and hemlock, but then in that canopy gap, you see a whole bunch of this young yellow birch that's starting to grow up. And you can see where those old trees have rotted down, and there's different mounds and topography that's created from it. Without that disturbance, that yellow birch would never be there. So those are the final thoughts, and we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Elliot. I think just those final points about safety are so, so important, no matter what you're doing in the bush, but especially when we are dealing with a chainsaw, dealing with broken branches. We've got lots of questions coming in on the chat here. And I just wanted to thank everyone for putting in an introduction, including their chapter. Lots of folks here, particularly from Huron-Perth, Huronia, Kawartha, Renfrew, Lanark District, Lower Ottawa Valley, and others. I'll encourage people to continue adding questions into the chat here. And if it works for you, Elliot, maybe I'll just read out a couple and we can take them question by question. There was a question here a few minutes ago by Eileen. She said, considering the quick growth of sprouting response, wouldn't they also be vulnerable to future damage? Is this considered quality regeneration?
As always, it's going to depend. Um, yeah. Uh, if they're growing very densely next to each other, they're less likely to form a wider canopy with, branch unions at different angles. And then once they've reached a certain height, so for poplars, that could be after maybe 5 or 15 years. For slower growing species, that might take longer. Then you can consider doing some thinning so that now they can start to they've reached the height, whatever that is, 15 meters, 20 meters. Then when you do some light thinning, the trees are going to be able to increase in diameter. So yeah, a further answer would require more specifics. Yeah.
Thanks, Elliot. It's so complicated with so many different species and so many different site conditions, but it really does depend. And like you said so many times in this presentation, getting a forester or an arborist is always helpful. Read out another one here for you, Elliot. There's an individual where about 70% of their red pine plantations were unfortunately destroyed in southeast Muskoka. What do you suggest to be done with the trees that have fallen and those who have lost the top 5 to 10 meters?
Yeah, so that might be a situation where you can get a logger in to do a salvage harvest, which is going to help clean up a lot of that mess as well and make it easier to navigate through that woodlot to assess things like regeneration. So as soon as possible, like when we finish this webinar, I would look at local registered professional foresters in your area, give a few of them a call and see if any of them can help you out finding a logger. And of course, assessing if a salvage harvest is possible in the first place. If that's not an option, then and where to find loggers, professional foresters. On our website, we've got a Forest Service Provider Index. So you can look there, or a Forest Service Provider Directory. The Ontario Professional Foresters Association also has a directory of members. So those would be two places to go, our own website or the Ontario Professional Foresters Association website. And then, yeah, if you can't find a logger to do the work, then I would just start with very, very small, establish some trails that you can move through that area, start knocking things down to the ground and assessing the regeneration.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Elliot. Rick raised his hand here. I believe you should be able to add a point there now, Rick, if you would like to. We can also continue with questions otherwise. And this is Rick Wismer from Niagara Chapter, CPA.
Yes, Elliot, I noticed that you did include some commentary about revenues and expenses. I just wanted to perhaps add a couple of points there. First of all, even if people haven't been in the position of claiming expenses on their personal tax return in the past, if they are in a position where they get significant revenues from reclaiming merchantable timber, just wanted to point out that normally Revenue Canada would consider that to be taxable income. If it's just, cutting a bit of firewood for yourself or friends, not so much. But if you actually get a logger in and you're shipping a fair bit of timber to a sawmill, you probably have a taxable transaction. So you should be following that up and not getting a surprise from Revenue Canada at a future point in time that you missed reporting. At the same time, as you've pointed out, expenses can be deductible on your personal tax return. And that's even if you don't have any revenue in the year. If it happens to be associated with another business, for instance, many farmers have a woodlot at the back of the farm, and every 20 or 30 years, they may harvest some timber. It's not as important to have a managed forest plan, but particularly if you have no other sources of income associated with your forestry practice, it's a really good idea to have that managed forest plan, because Revenue Canada looks at that as evidence that you're intending to have a business. So even if you don't have revenue in a year, you can deduct expenses against other sources of income. And Revenue Canada does understand that a forestry operation may mean revenue only every 20 years, let's say. But having that managed forest plan may allow you to deduct expenses associated with this year's cleanup. But in addition to that, things like property taxes or insurance or equipment that you may have to buy to manage your forest could all be deducted against other sources of income. So in effect, Revenue Canada is helping you do some of the costs of the forestry management.
Thanks very much, Rick. Really appreciate you adding in a bit of a business and tax perspective there. If you do have any resources that we could share with folks via email after as well, that'd be very helpful. But just a few words that you shared there, we really do appreciate it.
Very good.
Excellent, thank you. I got a few more minutes here and a few more questions in the chat for Elliott. We've got a couple here about debris that I'll ask you about. One that's maybe more of a, I guess, a maybe not technical, but what do you do with it kind of question, and more about the effects of forest fire. So we'll start with the latter there. So Robin is a new woodlot owner, and she's asking, when leaving trees on the ground or felling damaged trees, what's the best way to leave them? Beside one another, or can they be on top of each other? What would you suggest there, Elliott?
As close to the ground as possible. Yeah, if they're in contact with the ground, there's going to be more nutrient transfer, and there's generally going to be more habitat for things like salamanders. Yeah, it's not a big deal if some are a little bit higher. In the Great Lakes St. Lawrence region, it's very unlikely for dead wood close to the ground to start or hold a forest fire.
Thanks, Elliott. I think there's lots of great opportunities there for biodiversity as well, if that's a value and an objective of your woodlot as well. So kind of related to that with the fallen trees, Laura has asked, in plantations, if we leave brush or fallen trees to decompose, is this a concern for forest fires? Should we be managing the fallen trees in a different way than just leaving it to decompose if forest fires are a concern in our area?
Yeah, so generally not a concern. Larger diameter wood is very, very unlikely to catch on fire. If there are bigger brush piles, it could catch on fire with a lightning strike or something like that. So don't make your piles too big, and don't make them too open where it's like looking like a campfire. If it's all kind of like denser, organized in the same direction, much less likely to catch on fire.
Thanks very much. We're just throwing all the questions at you. This one's taking a little bit of a turn about oak wilt. So Marilyn asked in the chat, we have open cuts on white oak due to the ice storm. How can we protect the trees from oak wilt? Should we paint the open cuts? And if yes, is there anything that you can suggest?
I don't know if painting would do anything. So yeah.
Maybe something for our friends at the Invasive Species Center. We would suggest reaching out to
Exactly.
them.
Yeah, I would reach out to them.
Perfect. And maybe we can include their website as well. It's easy to find on Google as well. Another question that came up in the chat is a bit of a concern about white spruce. So the coniferous examples that you were showing in the presentation resemble a white pine. Is the recovery similar for all coniferous trees? And again, she's specifically concerned about white spruce rather than white pine specifically.
Yeah. So in terms of the percentage of crown damage, that can be applied to white spruce as well. So if it's got greater than 75% of the crown missing, it's probably not going to recover. When comparing white spruce to white pine generally has a better ability to send out or to extend its branches and its crown than white spruce. But white spruce will send out new shoots and branches as well. So yeah, really the way of assessing it is the same. Look at the amount of crown damage and then monitor it throughout the year to see how much that canopy is filling back in.
Thanks, Elliott. Just getting to a few final questions here. Not sure how this is a specific poplar question and crown damage. Marco Marco said in the chat, great info. Granted, the most important thing is to monitor over the next 3 to 5 years. And I'm assuming that's after ice storm damage or damage specifically. I noticed that some of the poplar we have 30 inches in diameter within a dense mixed stand. So that's a pretty dense poplar. Have not sprouted their leaves yet, but have less than 50% crown damage. Some other poplars nearby have sprouted. How do poplars do with crown damage?
So they generally will recover. If the poplars are 30 inches in diameter, they're probably pretty old for poplars. And it might be that these trees, because of their age, don't have as much vigor left. I would start looking to see if you can see any false tinder fungi or other diseases that affect and fungi that affect older poplars. That could be the reason why those bigger poplars, even though they don't have that much crown damage, are not yet sprouting, but others are.
Thanks, Elliot. And there's lots of thanks going on in the chat as well. I just had one final question here, rather a bit of a story that someone had shared that they'd lost a lot of trees in their red pine plantation. They're doing a salvage cut with loggers right now, and they lost hundreds of trees, which I think is a situation that a lot of people are in, unfortunately, right now. And they basically had to do a clear cut, and now they're going to start with planting more trees. And like Elliot said in the presentation, there are programs out there to plant more trees, including the 2 billion tree program as well. Excellent. Well, that's all of our questions, and it's now 1 o'clock. Thanks, Elliot, and Rick as well, and Glenn for sticking it out as panelists and for offering some information throughout this session. It's been something that we've wanted to do for several weeks now since the ice storm, and we're glad that we were able to bring this to everyone today. And as I mentioned, this presentation has been recorded, and it'll be shared with everyone who's registered for this this presentation and also with OWA members. Any final thoughts, Elliot and Glenn?
No, I think I would reiterate, I put in the chat there, go to the OWA library. Elliot mentioned so many different resources. That's where we house them all. So for those who want them, go get them there. And awesome job, Elliot. Thank you.